Give you a little background. I was a folklorist working for the Florida Folklife Program, which is under the Florida Department of State, for just under 20 years. The last year I was there, I was the official state folklorist. I retired in 2010, semi-retired. And I was the principal field worker and co-curator of an exhibit of the same name, which is presently installed at the State Fairgrounds, a museum on the State Fairgrounds, the South Florida Fairgrounds in West Palm Beach. At the end of this year, it'll be moving to the State Fair as a permanent venue. The budget for that was just approved by the board just this Monday, so that's good news. So, by the way, that's young Seminole cattleman Justin Gopher with his cracker horse. And what a cracker horse is, Florida and North America had no cattle or horses until they were introduced by the Spanish. Our great claim is that the first cattle to come to what's now the United States came to Florida. Ponce de Leon brought those in 1521. Now those cows, which have evolved, with natural selection over nearly 500 years, are known as cracker cattle, and the horses are known as cracker horses. Just a few quick facts about Florida cattle ranching today. We have the largest, we're in the cow-calf business, which means our cattle ranchers raise calves and ship them out west to feedlots and other areas where they're brought to final weight size. So that's our business, that's our crop is calves. And these are called cow-calf operations. And we have the largest cow-calf herd in the U.S. It's at the Deseret Ranch, which is owned by the Mormon Church, most of it is just south of Disney. It's about 300,000 acres. They have 44,000 cows, what they call mama cows. We're also home to 4 of the 10 largest cow-calf operations in the U.S. And nearly half of all Florida agricultural lands are in cattle production, and you can see the size of our grazing lands, 4 million acres of pasture and 1 million acres of grazed woodlands. A lot of our cattle are in the woods, as they say. I put this together when I did a presentation out in Elko, Nevada. We have more cattle than all these western states, including Wyoming, which is the cowboy state. So how about that? Here's a map, I think you can see it okay, this magnification out in the audience, of cattle distribution in the New World. Over there on the far right, cattle first came from, there's the laser, on Columbus's second voyage from Spain in 1493, landed on the island of Hispaniola, which is now half Dominican Republic and half Haiti. And they're not sure of the exact site, but they're pretty sure where he landed. It's in the Dominican Republic, what's now the Dominican Republic now. But in 1521, Ponce de Leon brought cattle to Florida, to Charlotte Harbor. Now, I'm not dead certain that they came from Havana, but I'm pretty sure. I'm not a historian, so if anybody has any corrections to history, please let me know. And there were some other attempts to bring cattle into northern western Florida. Maldonado was one, I think, in 1540. He brought some cattle. We're almost sure, not totally sure, that Ponce de Leon's cattle probably died with him. He was killed, I think, within 2 weeks of his second landing in 1521, or second or third voyage. Anyhow, his 1521 landing. And he just had a few cattle, and we don't think that they went on to be the foundation stock for what we call cracker cattle now. But we do know that Menendez brought 200 head to St. Augustine in 1565. They were all heifers, all females, some of which were no doubt pregnant. That's why they didn't bother bringing any bulls, figuring that some of the calves would be males. That was in 1565. We also know that they had a really bad food shortage, and at one time, I believe, Alan, they were down to 12 head. There's some record of that they got down to as few as 12 head. So we're not real sure, at least I'm not, Alan may know more than me, about how many of those propagated. But we do know that by the end of the Civil War, it's estimated there were 400,000 wild descendants of the Spanish cattle. That's a lot of cattle. This is a nice map by historian Joe Ackerman, who's also a pretty good artist, and sketched up, there's no quantities here, but the location of the ranchos, Spanish ranchos in 1680. Some old Spanish brands, again, sketched by Ackerman, who died, a year and a half ago, yeah. Some artifacts associated with the Spanish, not the cattle, but the horses. It's interesting that this spur came off the Atocha, which wrecked in 1622. Here's what one cracker cow looks like, fairly typical. They come in all sorts of color schemes, but this spotted or pied version is rather common. They have probably a different set of the horns than most people are used to looking at. And here's a cattle mounted whole cow that's in our exhibit. And I wanted to throw this in because it shows the slim body. You can see it's much slimmer. And mind you, this cow came from the state. The state has a herd of cracker cattle. So this cow's been well taken care of. It hasn't had to forage in the woods. So the ones that were foraging, scrounging out of life in the woods were much slimmer and smaller. But this also really shows an excellent set of horns. They don't all look like this, but this is fairly typical. This one was hand selected by the fellow who manages the herd. This cow was at its end of its life. So as he said, it could continue to serve the public as a exhibit specimen or as McDonald's. In the early 18th century, the British, and with the help of some Native Americans, came down into Florida and wiped out most of the Spanish ranchos. And so after that time, through most of the 18th century, that is the 1700s, the Native Americans were our chief cattle ranchers. The British weren't established cattle ranching yet, the crackers that came a little later. So the Native Americans kept it up. This is a facsimile of a letter that's owned by the Seminole tribe of Florida. It's a letter from Governor Moultrie to the leader, Native American leader. At that time, they were known as Cow Creeks. They were just beginning to be known as Seminoles. And his name was Cowkeeper, and he had a large herd on what's now called Payne's Prairie. There's rumors you'll see in the literature where they claim he had 10,000 head. No way. I don't think with modern ranching, with improved pasture, you could run 10,000 head of cattle on Payne's Prairie. So it might have been more like 1,000. You think, Alan? Something like that would be a lot. Anyhow, this is very interesting. And in this letter, by the way, Governor Moultrie is asking Cowkeeper to help him to head off a war with I believe it was the Cherokees. There was a dispute over 2.1 million acres of hunting land. And in fact, Cowkeeper did help out, but it shows the significance of Cowkeeper. Even back then, they were shipping cattle to Cuba. The Native Americans were. So in the 19th century, what people we now call crackers started coming down from chiefly Georgia and maybe even more so from South Carolina. There was a lot of cattle ranching. They were basically people of British stock, came down and settled in Florida. And a big impetus was the Armed Occupation Act, which was a sort of homesteading act I believe that was 1840. So they had a pretty rough time, coming down in these covered wagons or just walking, well, coming down in covered wagons that were pulled by oxen and carving out an existence out of Florida. This is a shot of a cattle drive. This is one of the older photos in the archives, in the state archives, cattle drive around Bartow in the 1890s. We can't tell, at least I can't tell by looking at the photo if that's an African American or not, but it looks like it to me. But the photo is very contrasty. It's just hard to tell. But we do know that African Americans were among the first people to actually work with cattle. They had experience from Africa. And in fact, I believe the curator of the Florida Black Cowboy exhibit at the Florida Ag Museum stated that she thinks the term cowboy came from African Americans. Like there was houseboys, there were slaves that were houseboys, there were cowboys. This is a cracker horse, and 1902 with a young man on it. You can see this gives you a good idea. I think even if you don't know horses, you can tell this horse is pretty small. They also have a characteristic head shape. I'm not that good at recognizing it, but you can certainly tell this horse is pretty small. It's the same, parent stock as the Western Indian ponies and so forth. Just as and Alan may correct me on this, just as our cattle came from the same basic stock as what evolved to be Texas Longhorns and the Mexican Corrientes, which is, if you go to rodeo events, the calves and steers that they use there are Corrientes. They look very much like cracker cattle. In fact, the Corrientes were used in our second Florida cattle drive because they couldn't get enough cracker cattle. It was just easier to get the Corrientes. After the Civil War, this started before the Civil War, but after the Civil War, Florida, like the rest of the South, was in deep, dire economic straits, and of course, currency was worthless. There were real problems with that. But we had this great business of shipping these wild cattle principally to Cuba, also some to the Bahamas. The ones that we shipped to Spanish Cuba, the cattlemen got paid in gold doubloons, $10 and $15 a head. They had to pay a commission to the shippers, and this, by the way, the shippers were people like Dr. Likes of the Likes brothers. He had a schooner. And as I stated before, Joe Ackerman believed that there were was Florida's principal cattle historian, believed there were about 400,000 of these wild descendants of the Spanish cattle that you didn't have to own them. All you had to do was round them up, which wasn't easy. They were as wild as deer. And wild and dangerous, but if you could round them up and ship them. Most of them were shipped out of Punta Rasa, some were shipped out of Tampa. Punta Rasa, they finally erected a small plaque there. It's at the foot of the Sanibel Island Bridge, so that's where Punta Rasa is, over on the Gulf Coast south of Tampa. This is a later photo, of course. This is early 20th century, but you can see it's the cracker cattle. You can see the horns, the thin body type, in cow pens at Punta Rasa. We move right along to the 20th century. The challenge at that time was Florida, in terms of improving its breeds, was pretty late in the game compared to much of the rest of the nation. It was sort of like the last frontier in improving breeds. And one thing we had to do to improve our cattle breeds and to raise better beef stock was we tried the English breeds, of course, which are the Hereford and the Angus. And there was I guess the Charolais, which is a French, and Limousin, they're French cattle. They came later, but chiefly the English breeds at first. I guess Shorthorn is another English breed, I believe. And we needed more than that. We started improving the breeds early in the 20th century, largely by introducing the Brahmins into the mix. Now, meanwhile, you might be thinking, what's happening to our Spanish cattle? They were still in the mix in many areas, but they're also sort of being bred out. And in, what was it, the 1980s, we woke up and said, hey, we're losing these cattle. They were known as scrub cattle. And that's when the movement started to preserve them, and as well as the horses.